Welcome, Tomas. You are now head of strategy at Väst, which you previously led for a long time. Could we start by you just telling us a little bit about what Väst does?
Yeah, Väst is a regional film fund, but a little bit different from many of the regional film funds existing in Europe. Due to Swedish law, we need to invest money in and we cannot just give a grant. And so far we have co-produced, co-financed more than 700 feature films and of course a vast number of drama series, short films, documentaries. But I will strongly underline that Väst is more than anything a film fund. So not as many others have done moved themselves to predominantly work with drama series. We still work predominantly with feature films and supporting feature films, and here is everything from prestigious Cannes winners like Dancer in the Dark and The Square, Oscar winning In a Better World, and to audience crowd pleasers like A Man Called Ove or The 100-Year-Old or the Millennium series.
Co-production giant. So you have just published an article discussing the pandemic's effects on the film industry. And I'm planning to pick your brain, but I thought we would start by sketching an image of where we were in January, and I will begin, and then you can tell me if I've forgotten anything. Okay, let's imagine we're back to when we last met, in fact, here at the Göteborg Film Festival, which had just then become the first major international festival to present a lineup of 50% female directors. And to the surprise even of the programmers, that was easy to achieve without compromising on quality. In the industry more broadly, a streaming service-driven TV drama boom meant that production was at capacity pretty much everywhere in the world. Certainly all over Europe, people were actually running out of production infrastructure, out of talent, and out of ideas. And at that point, producers had just started to worry that quality was already suffering because we had so much work. And in addition, of course, we were all making enormous amounts of theatrical features. In fact, we were making more of them than the cinemas could reasonably screen. And as a side effect of all of this demand, I will also say that it looked like things were finally moving pretty rapidly for diversity within the industry, just because that talent and those skills and those stories were so desperately needed. And I guess also on the macro level, societal changes, climate change and so on, were looming, but we were not expecting any major societal impacts on our industry within, let's say, the next 3 years. That was 5 months ago. Does it sound right?
Yeah, it sounds very right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So we were in a sort of boom mindset, but of course behind that there were a number of challenges that the industry had been struggling with long term. And I guess then the question to start this session with is, how much do we actually want to go back to where we were, let's say, last year?
Yeah, but my belief is that, and now we need to start saying that in Sweden, this very strange country, Sweden, we haven't stopped producing during the pandemic. So drama series, predominantly drama series, have been produced during the entire period. And you can say that feature film production stopped for a very, very short period of time, but it's back on a normal level, I will say, today. So from a very Swedish perspective, you can say that everything is more or less, in that sense, the same. Production is back to normal. The challenge that was not there before is, of course, everything that is linked to cinema, because nobody knows when it will work and how it will work when it can really open back on a normal capacity. And that means, of course, that we can discuss this further off later, that films for cinema and production for cinema will not go on as before, even if it does it right now. Because before everything works normal, there will be some sort of obstacles for producing a lot of content, I can say. When it comes to drama series, the situation is very different, and it also, I think, goes for the rest of the world, because now we can see production starting up in a lot of different territories. I think we can predict that series production within a couple of months is more or less back to to the level it was before. I'm not 100% sure because, of course, we cannot be 100% sure during this time, but I'm perhaps not increasing as much as it did before. It means that maybe we are on some sort of platform level. At least we will be for a period.
So you're saying that in fact this may be peak TV. We may have finally that that famous prediction of Landgraf's a few years ago. He said, okay, this can't continue. And I think in January you and I were talking, and we said probably 5 more years of growth in the number of original drama series. But now we have to adjust that and say, okay, perhaps we have now peaked.
Yeah, but I think it's not so much about the COVID-19 or SARS Corona 2 virus or whatever how we want to talk about this. But I mean, I think the economical recession is on a long-term basis, that's much more important than the pandemic itself. Because that will create a different landscape and a different situation for a lot of players. And we can see this, of course, already now, because broadcasters that predominantly need to work on the basis of commercial incomes from the commercials, of course, they suffer a lot right now. And you can also see very big cut downs in many of the companies of that type, broadcasters of that type. And even if they need to be back in competition once again, I still think there will not be such a strong driving force from those sources because they will not have the economy.
And there is also like the additional effect that because, for instance, we haven't had live sports almost anywhere in the world. A lot of people who have been loyal to linear television have now tried streaming services, often for the first time, and may not want to go back to that, especially in the advertising-funded models. In some countries, that's not a great viewing experience, and they may not want to go back to that for anything else than sports.
Yeah, and I also agree with that, and I still think it's I think it's a challenge because, of course, now you can watch soccer once again, but it's played without an audience, and even if you are looking at that on your television set, it's still not the same because the audience is some sort of crucial element, even for those that are not on the arena. So that's, of course, I think that's at least a challenge. And probably you will not see a lot of more subscriptions or interest in those type of events. Maybe also there on a platform level. But I still think that, and then, I mean, this is of course impossible to talk about because it will look very different in different countries. The economic recession, because it will be harder in some parts of the world, and it will be not so hard in some parts of the world. But I mean, if the enormous increase of subscriptions and of everything else and producing content should continue, money is a crucial element, and if there is less money around, I think also this industry, this part of this creative sector will suffer from that.
And I guess there are also secondary effects that we can't begin to imagine. Everything from just the traumatic impact on large populations in countries that have been very hard hit, and perhaps crops that have been ruined because they haven't been able to be harvested. These kinds of things that we're not seeing yet, and that we don't, or that are certainly reported, but we just don't have the bandwidth to understand all the nuances of what's happening. So I guess what I'm hearing you say is, well, we can't go back to how it was before. A lot of the financial structures that supported it, the generous public funding perhaps might not be there. Certainly in production incentives that might change, and also, as you're saying, the advertising industry in general will probably shrink. Do you feel that there are structural, like in the ongoing structural changes that were already happening in the industry? How do you feel those are affected?
Less because there was some sort of, it depends on how strongly you should interpret the word paradigm shift. What you personally believe that a paradigm shift is, but at least a big change. And a lot of those elements were already in place before the pandemic, and I cannot see that the epidemic has changed that. On the other hand, nearly the opposite. You can see that a lot of these big players buying small players, concentration, consolidation, all these things goes on. You can see all big players also have used this time, the pandemic, for what they call reconstructions and changing the organization, making it more doing it, modernize it, more streamlined and modernize it. And you can also see all these companies that plan to merge, that they are now changing positions. They have used this time to actually prepare themselves to go back to go back into the war. This is, of course, very much linked to companies that works predominantly with drama series or streamers or whatever.
I feel like we were convinced not that many months ago that what we were looking at was a sort of now the English word escapes me, but like a content race, that all of these new streaming competitors who need to compete on catalog would just need to just invest enormous amounts into production to have a shot at establishing themselves. And we felt that would drive an expansion in the production market for maybe 3-5 years, something like that. And then inevitably, and especially since a lot of that content would be financed by debt, not all of it, but some of it, that there would need to be a contraction. We felt that the market perhaps will not carry that many streaming services. Now I wonder, will some of these services just back out of this competition, or have they invested so much already that they have to try, even though, as we've seen, Quibi, of course, is the most famous example, but even Disney is having a difficulty right now because they can't add more content. What do you think will happen with the streaming wars?
I think the streaming war will continue. It will go on, and you can see it will probably be a little bit delayed. And look a little bit different. I mean, when they more or less released, or whatever we should call it, HBO Max, that was not a big success. Of course, you can say that regarding Disney, that they have no new content coming in right now. On the other hand, you can say they are looking for an audience that, at least the kids, where they can actually see the same content for
that is so true
1,000 times or whatever. So I mean, there is still some sort of that can attract new subscribers there, but they need to go back to the war, and this is also very important for the production community, because that's something that makes, of course, the production will start running again, and you can also see certain players during this period that's desperately been forcing their productions, particularly in Sweden, to continue because they cannot stand still. And it's also to create that predictability that is very important for a production company if they want to survive, that there is some sort of continuity. My big fear is that, okay, now people are completing, production companies, they are completing films, cinema films that they already started working with, that were already financed before the crisis. But will there be a lot more? Because I can see, at least we can see, that there are so much fewer projects really seriously developed, and more or less a lot of companies stopped develop new content for cinema during this period. And of course that will create some sort of difficult situation, because even if you talk to a Hollywood studio, they will say that cinema is a blockbuster industry, but cinema is so much more than a blockbuster industry. And of course cinema overall, they also need new, interesting, challenging, whatever content. And if too little is developed, seriously developed and produced, that will create a difficult situation. I guess something like 12 a year from now, or something like that.
It's ironic also, because you'd think, you would assume that there's plenty of time for development right now when nothing else is happening. But of course, again, a lot is going on in people's lives, and also in this industry, people are human and are under enormous pressure, especially everywhere except in Sweden.
But I also think that since there is those players, the streaming services, the bigger broadcasters, they desperately need new content because they are suffering from that right now, because they need to give that to their audiences, to their subscribers, whatever it is. So they desperately need that content coming in, and they are there with their money and things and working. On the other hand, you can see public funders suffered, not because they probably have less funding, but they need to put a lot more money into projects that were already there from the beginning, so they can complete those productions. That means less money for new projects, less money for development. And this situation creates, so I think the move, let's call it the producing community's move from feature filmmaking to serial drama making or singles for streamers, that is even stronger right now than it was before.
Yes, and of course, as you're also right about in your article, which everyone should read, also just the production will of course become more expensive in itself. Absolutely. So also for that reason, the public funders will probably need to allocate more for each project. At the same time, on some levels, we were making, I know that you don't like, as a funder, you don't like to hear this, but we were making more movies than we needed. We were making more films than we could possibly connect with audiences. So in a way, if the adjustment is that the right films get made, and the best films and the most relevant and urgent films get made, then this is good, because they might have a better shot at reaching an audience. Yeah,
I totally agree with you, because it might be something that in the end turns out well, because if it's fewer and better film that will be released in the cinemas, they will also have a potential to have more capacity when we are back going to the cinema. I guess you will discuss this in the panel later, but I mean, this is also, of course, one of the big challenges. And as yesterday there was a Swedish survey that more or less said that 25% of cinema goers will probably not go back to cinema for a quite long period. A couple of weeks ago it was a very big Danish survey that showed more or less the same, that with one exception, people that go to see Danish movies, they were prepared to quite soon start going to see a lot of films again. But a big part of the audience were not so, that was not their priority when all the restrictions are gone, that cinema was not their priority. And I think this is also a challenge, because how create a secure, and I think that will drive a restructuring of what cinemas are in the end, but during that will not happen a year from now. It's a longer term. I
think, although, and I'm not suggesting you're doing it, but I am hearing in the industry a little bit this sort of concern, or when we're talking about when will people be ready to return to the cinema, there is a little bit of this tone that unfortunately we love to do. We kind of blame the audience, and here I think I have to say that it's very rational to not want to return to, I mean, at least before we have a vaccine, for enormous swathes of the population, it's very rational to try and minimize sitting indoors, you know, with strangers. And I wanted to suggest to you 3 scenarios for the pandemic's development. The best case scenario, the middle scenario, maybe the likely scenario, and the worst case scenario. And I think in the best case scenario, the pandemic will be under control in the world by, let's say, March next year, and the vaccine will be introduced soon thereafter, and this opening is leading back into some kind of business as usual. I guess in the worst case scenario, we will not have a vaccine for at least 2 or 3 years, and that means that every country must work its way towards herd immunity through flare-ups and shutdowns and you know, in a circular way, with contact tracing and self-isolation becoming a big part of our life, and that any of us at any given moment might be unable to actually make it to the movie theaters. And again, those secondary effects that we don't even know yet, and things that can be caused by the financial crisis. And I guess the third scenario is somewhere in between. Maybe we get a vaccine a year from now. We have a better understanding of how people are affected, and our economies can open relatively rapidly. And maybe we can have normal production and exhibition by the end of next year. That would be fantastic. Yeah. Which scenario do you believe in?
Yeah, but I believe in the mid scenario, because I think it will take at least 1.5 years from now before we are a little bit back to the same level as before. And that of course, vaccine is a game changer, but it's not the only game changer, because I think there is also a lesson learned by the pandemic, and it's not only a lesson for society and a lot of, but it's also a lesson for each person. And I think we will act not all of us will act exactly the same as we did before. Yeah. And I think a lot of people will not strongly long for being locked into a small room with a lot of other people sitting very tight and things like that. So I mean, there is some sort of psychological effects that I think will be there even in the future. And of course there is a second thing, and because I think the economical recession and a lot of people becoming unemployed, suffering, I mean, households suffering economically, and how will you then spend your money? And I think this is a much sharper question, and will be a much sharper question also 1.5 years from now. So I think we will be a little bit back to normal with or without a vaccine 1.5 years from now. There is at least a chance for that.
I have a worry, though, that it seems that very many in the industry are hoping for the best scenario, and they're a little bit like la 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 about all the other options. Like they don't want to look at that, and that seems in any business and in any situation, it's a terrible strategy to refuse to acknowledge that even the likeliest scenario is worse than what you're preparing for. What would you say to those people? They are of course extremely naive, and during this period I've spoken to a lot of extremely naive people in the industry, even those that more or less says that okay, when we have Tenet and when we have Mulan in the cinemas, everything will be back to normal, and that means back to normal late July this year, and that's people that works in the cinema industry, whatever it's called, that I think they are not at all prepared to think that this is so to speak, the problems are not solved, because you can say, okay, now we allow 100 people in a room that have space for 250 and things like that. That will not be the solution, because it will not really be back to normal. And also on the level, it's not just on the level of the science, but on the level of the titles. In a normal year, never ever would you say that an animation remake and a Christopher Nolan movie, much though I love his work, that those are going to be the biggest movies that are going to save your season. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. And but now everybody is very convinced that those films are exactly what people are yearning for.
Yes, absolutely. And it's also a very strange belief, certain players and also both production companies, distributors and whatever, they can also make sort of thinking that looks like we can allow 50 people in every room, every screening room. Now we release our films. And then we predict the audience figures. And the audience figures are then based on selling all the 50 tickets in all rooms, all times, wherever they are screened. And then we will still have a very good audience. But of course, that will not happen. Yeah. That's also extremely naive, because that never happens. You cannot sell all seats, all different, whatever you do. So, I mean, there will be a period where cinema films, not only cinema, but cinema films will go through some sort of very harsh times, and I also think that will create some sort of transformation of cinemas and what cinemas are, because of course in the end we will come back to the big screen, and because I strongly believe still in feature films and cinema films future, but I mean there will be a hard time.
Thank you. We're out of time. At this point, I would like to thank you, Tomas Eskilsson, and direct everyone out there again to read this article, which you can find at filmivast.se. We will also link to it on the Nostradamus website under the Göteborg Film Festival. Thank you so much, Tomas, for joining us. And we will now take a minute to reshuffle our set and continue with our panel.